the media does never, ever tells what really happened. I had been involved in a lot of demonstrations or other activities where the media just distorted it. Well, the media comes in, let's say you're having a meeting, it's an hour and two hour long meeting. Media will come in, they'll film about 30 seconds, and then they'll leave. And they'll say, this is what happened at this meeting. And you know what happened at the meeting, because you were there for the whole thing. But the general public who sees what they filmed for the 30 seconds says, oh, I know what happened at that meeting because I saw it on TV. And it's just 30 seconds. It only showed a small piece of what happened, and it didn't really reflect it well.
Does media shape and affect the actions of the public, or is it the other way around? Do the people in society, through their actions, shape the news themselves? Taking glimpses of reality and drawing false assumptions and generalizations clearly violates one of the key principles of the SPJ Code of Ethics, which states that journalists should seek the truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable. They should be honest, fair, and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information, and they should not oversimplify or highlight incidents out of context. This dilemma has existed for centuries, dating back to the eve of the American Revolution in 1770, when the events of the Boston Massacre were distorted by leading colonial newspapers in order to push a particular political agenda. 200 years later, during the height of the Vietnam War, this dilemma was evident across the country in major news organizations such as the New York Times Company, the 3 major TV networks, and even in Ithaca, New York, through the Gannett Company and its ownership of the Ithaca Journal. During the Vietnam War, the Ithaca Journal was consistent with the rest of the news media in their general support for the war. Editorial after editorial featured complacent support with America's decisions in the war, a direct contrast to the budding anti-war sentiments felt by the majority of Ithacans at the time. President Nixon advocated his Vietnam policy under support of the great silent majority. But was this a farce created by his administration and propagated by the media? Nixon was ignoring the huge numbers of people across the country fervently against the war. Not only did Nixon and the mainstream press ignore the anti-war protesters, the Ithaca Journal characterized the demonstrations as ill-conceived, misinformed outcries by a bunch of young rabble-rousers.
I wasn't reading the journal in those years, and for those reasons. And I would say that they were less conservative and less devotedly for the war. They were basically poopy, boring, institutional, thoughtless, and trying for some kind of corporate centrism.
Millions of people around the country became part of the anti-war movement, but newspapers feared they would lose their traditional conservative demographic if they disagreed with U.S. policy in Vietnam. Losing this demographic meant losing profit, and they also feared being viewed as unpatriotic. Because of these fears, newspapers nationwide, including the Ithaca Journal, lost the ability to accurately portray the anti-war movement. But voices slipped through the cracks of mainstream media, leading to the rise of a new and growing alternative media.
There wasn't one alternate voice. There were lots of alternate voices who, with relatively cheap printing presses, could actually establish 3 or 4 alternate presences.
These alternative outlets were not constrained by any corporate ownership, and therefore operated under the ethical principle known as the veil of ignorance. Famed philosopher John Rawls theorized that a veil of ignorance should exist when dealing with ethical issues in mass communication. Justice emerges when negotiating without social differentiations, he said. In other words, consider how all parties feel when reporting the news.
To really get the word out of what's really happening is to report it ourselves.
I think it's confusing at some level between ideological conviction and corporate lack of conviction. I'm not sure what the motive was for the journal to basically have taken that posture, but of course the journal was a pretty traditional paper and had a traditional advertising base and what it thought was a traditional readership, and so it was responding, I think, to the older sense of Ithaca and not to the university communities in Ithaca. Semicolon, however, there was the growth of an alternate press.
Alternative outlets such as the Ithaca New Times began covering topics from the standpoint of ordinary citizens, not the media conglomerate. The Ithaca New Times proved a local success, and in 1967, the Glad Day Press, created by Jack Goldman, emerged and followed suit, publishing anti-war booklets and visiting Ithaca College and Cornell University to hear from the voices of students.
Glad Day Press did a lot of things. They put out first issue, I think it was called, Teal Hero. At Ithaca we put out Ithaca I See Peace. There were a lot of other, publications that were put out by people who were really working firsthand.
And the Glad Day Press functioned as a kind of clearinghouse for a lot of universities. We printed materials, off-prints of articles and anti-war materials mainly.
Something that was started by a few Ithaca College students called at that point the Ithaca New Times. Now the current Ithaca Times is the third or fourth level descendant of what was a much more radical community operation in the early 70s to try to be not the Journal.
The people working for these new outlets weren't necessarily professionally trained journalists. They were just people who saw the truth being misconstrued and underreported by mainstream media, and wanted to relay that truth to as many people as possible. These people were driven by the right to know, not profit or political agenda, and, like the veil of ignorance, they were operating without social differentiation. As the political climate shaped their views, they too began to shape the political climate in their local societies.
Did people shape the media, or did the media shape people? Well, it's both, always. It's always both. It's reciprocal. People saw the leftist media, the alternative media, like the Ithaca Times, as an outlet for expression of certain values in a way that they didn't see, let's say, the Gannett and the USA Today papers as the same. Nevertheless, a lot of issues and themes were on people's minds, and of course that was news.
It's a very precarious proposition to me, because a lot or most of the good reporting on the internet still has to come from real journalists, whether they're working for a newspaper or some other organization. You get very few good internet reporters who don't have those connections and training. So I still think it's an open question whether we can function as a society without those kinds of trained people who understand what it means to write an article, to investigate a problem and follow up, know what questions to ask.
So, but I am sure that their readership has diminished. And frankly, if one wants national news, one goes to either the television or to online sources. I rely on the New York Times. I do not read the Ithaca Journal for any news of essence. In fact, my joke is I just write for the paper, I don't read it.
The big newspapers, like the Los Angeles Times, where I came from, owned by a wealthy family, the Chandler family in Los Angeles, they still had certain standards for journalism, and those seem to have just gone by the board.
Quite a few jobs have been lost, and if you go down to the Ithaca Journal building right now and walk in, it looks like a morgue. I mean, it's just a very depressing place. With that diminishment in staff, in the paper size, has come a lack of Ithacans, and there's a huge community here. There's a huge permanent community as well as the community at the 3+ colleges in the area. There is a huge need for a daily paper, and the Ithaca Journal is the main source, and yet what it's been able to offer has diminished.
When the media fails to accurately reflect the views of the people will and should create their own alternative media. When the truth is being distorted, both journalists and citizens have an ethical obligation to help correct the inaccuracies. From Vietnam, we learned that corporate media does not always portray reality and can skew its messages based on particular political agendas. It takes alternative voices to make a difference. Today, these voices come in the form of blogs, documentaries, and alternative magazines and newspapers. Whatever the form of media, the truth should be the ultimate factor in deciding what is published.